outstanding reporter, cutting-edge reporter on national security issues, national security correspondent for Fox News, Jennifer Griffin. How are you?
Thank you, Mark.
Jennifer Griffin, well, let me just throw it out to you. What is happening today with Russia in Syria?
Well, Mark, I received a call at about 4:15 in the morning, East Coast time, from a military source who told me that a 3-star Russian general had arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad with a démarche. That's a official diplomatic appeal, and requested in stern terms that the U.S. military and its warplanes over Syria exit Syria, and any forces that the U.S. had on the ground in Syria, any allied forces, that they be moved out. This surprised the Pentagon. It surprised U.S. military officials who are in charge of the air campaign over Iraq and Syria. It was out of the blue. It came one day after President Obama spent 90 minutes meeting with President Vladimir Putin in New York. They had discussed ways in which they were going to deconflict their military actions over Syria and coordinate, possibly in the future, actions against ISIS on the ground. But what ended up happening today is the Russians essentially did an end run around the U.S. military and began carrying out airstrikes for the first time inside Syria. What's significant here is that Russia says publicly that they're going after ISIS targets, but if you look at where those Sukhoi 24 warplanes are firing, they're firing on areas where the Free Syrian Army, U.S. allies, are based. They are not firing on areas where ISIS is located. We heard from the Defense Secretary today at the Pentagon, who had a somewhat confusing press conference in which, on the one hand, he said they were going to keep talking to the Russians. He chastised them for what he thought was an unsustainable policy in Syria. But what's very clear is that the U.S., the State Department, the Pentagon, the White House, they are out of options in Syria. They can't remove Bashar Assad. Russia knows it. They're filling the vacuum there. In the last 2 weeks alone, Mark, they have essentially popped up a Russian air base. They have sneaked in 32 fighter jets, and now they're carrying out airstrikes, and there's very little the U.S. and others can do about it.
There's very little the U.S. and others can do about it. So this is going to get worse before it gets better, isn't it?
It's going to get so much worse because what's going to happen is these airstrikes, we saw the first images coming out, and the Syrian human rights groups are putting out images showing that there are women and children being pulled out of the rubble. You're going to have, this is going to add to the refugee crisis. You just thought you saw a lot of refugees crossing over into Turkey, heading into Europe through Greece and elsewhere. This is going to add to the refugee problem. It's going to put pressure on Europe. Putin knows this. He's not concerned. He built up his forces overnight in Syria on the eve of him making his first speech at the United Nations General Assembly in 10 years. This is all part of Putin's grand plan to be back in the game, to be a superpower again, and to divert attention away from Ukraine, where his fighters have been on the ground. They invaded Crimea. The U.S. and the UN have not been able to stop him. NATO's not been able to stop him. And this is the next phase of his expansionist role. He basically wants to set up a Russian air base and naval base in the eastern Mediterranean.
Jennifer Griffin, I have to take a break. Can we carry you over to the next segment, please?
Absolutely.
And I think the question I'm going to ask you is, you say there's nothing we can do. Was there something we could have done early on? And what does our military think about what's going on as they have to essentially stand down and watch this take place? We'll be right back. Griffin, who is really knee-deep in this and is getting all kinds of information and doing outstanding reporting. Jennifer Griffin, thank you for holding. Our military sitting there, we have superior force, and they must be saying to themselves, good God, what's going on with the civilian leadership here? Look what's happening.
Well, I think there's a great disconnect between the people who are flying the missions over there, who are planning the missions, who are trying to hold together a coalition of 61 partners in Iraq and Syria, and to watch the pace of decision-making in Washington is truly very frustrating for them. I know because I've covered the Pentagon for 9 years. I know many of the people who are involved in the anti-ISIS mission, and there's a great deal of frustration. And we have a new chairman of the Joint Chiefs coming on board, General Joe Dunford. He starts on Thursday. We're technically between chairmen right now. General Dempsey retired last Friday. You've got the vice chairman, who's General Paul Selva, who's in charge right now. We haven't heard from him. We heard for the first time from Defense Secretary Ash Carter. He was the first U.S. official to speak on camera about this.
And he's the fourth Secretary of Defense.
Fourth Secretary of Defense. And that has sent a signal not only to the military, and by the way, did you listen to his press conference in the Pentagon today? It was not a press conference.
It was incoherent.
It was incoherent because he was also talking about budget cuts and about inserting women into combat roles and how that they were going to manage that process. That is not something when all eyes are on the Pentagon briefing room, are waiting to hang on every word of the U.S. Defense Secretary, to be talking about budget cuts and women going into combat and social changes within the military. It was incomprehensible that anyone would have advised him that was a good idea to talk about those three issues in the same press conference.
I just get the idea that these guys sit around and they noodle over these things. And let's look at this. They just got this Iran nuke deal through, right? Notice how Putin waited until that deal went through, and they moved with lightning speed after that deal went through for the Iranians. And every piece went in place. Nobody's going to stop them. Nobody can stop them under our president anyway. So they've been planning all along summer. You don't do this over a week, and they've been planning all summer. Maybe they were planning in the spring while these negotiations were going on. They knew exactly what they were going to do.
Listen, Mark, look at the timing of what we've reported in the last, since July 24th, when we first reported and we broke the news that Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian shadowy commander who's on multiple sanctions lists and who is the head of the Iranian Quds Force, he shows up in Moscow 10 days after the Iranian deal is announced, the Iranian nuclear deal is announced. He's not supposed to travel. He's not supposed to be cutting arms deals. He was there in Moscow meeting with Putin and with the defense secretary discussing this plan for Syria. We first reported it. All of what we have reported has come true in terms of the Syrian, the Russian and the Iranian collusion in Syria and now in Baghdad. Just last week, they set up an intelligence military coordination cell in Baghdad with the Russians now on the ground, the Iranians and the Syrians in Baghdad next to our embassy. When the U.S. military came in and saved the hides of the Iraqi government when ISIS began taking over the country, the U.S. military now has to share that space with the Russians. And now, by the way, any intelligence that's being shared with the Iraqi government and the Iraqi military, guess who they're sharing it with? The Russians and the Iranians. So this is a colossal disaster. This day will be remembered for some time in the future. It is a game changer in the Middle East.
And what about China? China's there too. China is going to build up Iran's oil and natural gas industries. China's not done either.
China is the biggest problem with China right now is that their cyber theft of trillions of dollars in U.S. R&D in the defense industry as well as elsewhere. That is the problem with China right now, is that they are unstopped in terms of the cyber hacking and the cyber espionage and how they are essentially stealing all of this country's greatest secrets and research and development in industry.
You know, Jennifer Griffin, I was listening to the Russian foreign minister, Lavrov, I guess his name is. By the way, he speaks awfully good English, doesn't he? Almost better than John Kerry. That's just me. But in any event...
When you're used to outmaneuvering the West, you learn a little English along the way.
Well, they really did run circles around us the last year. It's just incredible to me that our guys are all caught flat-footed, our guys, the civilian leadership. But John Kerry is shaking his head up and down to everything this man is saying. And this man just said, we're going to work out military communications. We just ceded that part of the world to the Russians, and he's shaking his head up and down.
Do you realize that the Russians knew that by carrying out the airstrikes today, the day that the Russians themselves are heading the UN Security Council, knowing that there was a UN Security Council meeting that the Russians were chairing, do you think that the UN Security Council was going to criticize the Russians if the Russians were chairing that meeting? That's the meeting that you just saw Secretary of State John Kerry come out of after meeting with Lavrov. Lavrov was chairing that meeting. So, no, the Russians know that they have a blank check right now in the Middle East, and nobody is going to stop them. And what did you hear John Kerry say, and what did you hear Secretary of Defense Ash Carter say? Is that we're going to keep talking to the Russians. This is like a bad joke, Mark. The Russians know they can bog us down in talks because they know that is what this administration believes in more than anything else, is talking. They saw it with the Iran nuclear talks. They bogged us down there, and they know that they can wait out the rest of this presidency by talking about what's going on in Syria. Meanwhile, Russia is setting up air bases, naval bases, and realigning all of the forces in the Middle East right now. And
the Iranians, through the Russians, are going to arm up Hezbollah and Hamas. You already saw Abbas announce that the Oslo Accords are dead. So they're encouraging the terrorist groups, the terrorist front groups. Now, the Israelis have to be saying, good God, what just happened?
Now, what we did learn today from well-placed sources is that the Israelis did receive the same notice that the Americans received from the Russians. The Russians told them about an hour before the airstrikes began in Syria, and that's because just 2 weeks ago, or a week ago, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, flew to Moscow to meet with Putin when he realized that he needed to have a face-to-face with Putin to tell him that in no uncertain terms, and by the way, I've learned that the head of Mossad was in that meeting as well, and they told the Russians that we have interest in Syria, we have interest in this area, you're getting mighty close to our interests, and we will act if needed. And so the Russians did alert the Israelis today. The question is, at what point there will come a point where they overstep and where it's going to get even messier in Syria.
In the face of all this, why in the hell would we be slashing our military?
That is the question. That's the $20 million question, or $586 billion question. I don't know, but I can tell you this: it's not the day to be talking about it from the Pentagon about slashing budgets and the budget cuts that are looming. And that's what you heard the Defense Secretary talking about today, warning about that. That is not the message you want to be delivering to the world stage on a day like today.
I think our enemies, and that's what they are, I think our enemies see an opportunity, and they're going to do everything they possibly can, and I've talked about this for many years on this program, to exploit this president, to exploit this Secretary of State, to exploit this truly pathetic administration. I'm speaking, not you. And they're going to go as far as they possibly can and just hope that the next president who's elected is not a tough person.
Well,
I think they're going to run as fast as they can, as far as they can.
The problem is they're taking advantage of a vacuum, and they're taking advantage of the knowledge that nobody's going to do anything for the next year. The U.S. is going to be bogged down in a presidential election, and they are not seeing any consequences for this kind of behavior, and that's really the problem here.
I think the only consequence, at least with this president, is going to be the election potentially of a president with a mandate to push back the Russians, to push back the terrorists, to push back the Iranians. I think that potential exists. I pray to God it exists, but we'll see what happens. You're reporting